Sheriff Ethan Waller is a man haunted by his past, living in the quiet, seemingly peaceful town of Maplewood. After losing his wife and son in a tragic fire, Ethan isolates himself emotionally, choosing the night shift to avoid the memories that plague him during the day. But everything changes when he notices Gracie, a young girl who appears alone at the local laundromat night after night. Ethan's curiosity about Gracie quickly turns to concern as he discovers she may be homeless, and his protective instincts are reawakened. As he digs deeper, uncovering a web of secrets involving the town's elites, Ethan realizes that Gracie's silence hides a dangerous truth, one that could unravel the town and connect to the very tragedy that destroyed his family. In a heart-wrenching twist, Ethan learns that Gracie is not only a victim but also holds the key to understanding his own loss. Caught between the town's dark history and his own desperate need for redemption, Ethan must decide how far he's willing to go to protect Gracie, and whether saving her will be the key to saving himself. Through the Silence is a gripping, emotional journey that explores the power of love, redemption, and the lengths we go to protect the ones we hold dear. Maplewood Police Station. Ethan sat behind his desk, his fingers tapping absently on the keyboard. The monitor in front of him displayed the search results for Gracie. He had combed through every town record, school registry, and missing persons file. Nothing. It was as if the girl didn't exist. "She's not from here," he muttered to himself. Frustration clawed at him. He had been so sure he would find something, anything that could lead him to her story. But there were no traces, no birth records, no enrollment in the local schools, no foster records. Maplewood was a small town, and people didn't just go unnoticed. Ethan pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the old linoleum floor. He stood, pacing the small office. The more he thought about it, the more questions piled up. Who was this girl? Where was her family? Why was she always alone? He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door, determined to start asking questions. Someone in this town had to know something. Setting: local diner, town streets. Ethan entered the small diner, the bell above the door chiming as he stepped inside. The scent of coffee and fried food greeted him, along with the murmur of quiet conversation. He spotted Ruth, the diner's owner, wiping down a counter. "Morning, Sheriff," she greeted him with a smile. "Morning, Ruth," Ethan replied, making his way over to the counter. He leaned against it, his expression serious. "I've got a question for you." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" "You ever seen a little girl, about 10 years old, dark hair, usually wears an oversized hoodie, around the laundromat?" Ruth thought for a moment, her brow furrowing. "I've seen a few kids run around here, but no one like that comes to mind." "Why? She in trouble?" "Maybe," Ethan said, more to himself than to Ruth. "I've been seeing her alone at night. Every time I try to talk to her, she runs. Can't shake the feeling something's not right." "Well, kids like that don't just disappear unless they've got reason to," Ruth said, leaning on the counter. "But I haven't heard anything about her. Why don't you try the folks near the laundromat? They'd know better." Ethan nodded, thanked Ruth, and made his way down the street, stopping at a few shops and homes near the laundromat. Each time, he got the same response. No one knew the girl. It was as if she had appeared out of thin air. As the day wore on, Ethan's frustration grew. The deeper he searched, the more elusive Gracie became. Setting: Dr. Alice Corwin's office. Ethan knocked on the door of the town's only child psychologist, Dr. Alice Corwin. She opened it, looking mildly surprised to see him. "Sheriff Waller," she greeted, adjusting her glasses. "What brings you here?" "I need your help with something," Ethan said as he stepped inside. Alice motioned for him to take a seat in her small office, cluttered with books on child psychology and certificates of her credentials. Ethan cut straight to the point. "There's a girl," he began. "I've seen her every night at the laundromat. She's always alone. Won't talk to me. I've tried looking into her background, but there's nothing. It's like she doesn't exist." Alice listened carefully, her hands folded on her lap. "And you're worried something's wrong?" "Yeah," Ethan admitted. "I don't know if she's homeless or hiding from something, but I need to know what I'm dealing with." "You ever seen her?" Alice shook her head. "No, I can't say I have. But if she's avoiding contact, she might have been through some trauma. Children don't hide unless they feel they need to. I could come by the laundromat and try talking to her if you'd like. Ethan nodded slowly. I'd appreciate that. Something about her. It's like she's carrying more than any kid should have to. Alice stood, offering him a sympathetic smile. I'll do what I can, but you might need to prepare yourself. Kids like that don't just run away from nothing. Setting, the laundromat, late at night. That night, Ethan returned to the laundromat. As he parked his car, he spotted Gracie through the glass windows, once again folding laundry, but this time something was different. He noticed the small bedroll tucked in the corner and a few food wrappers on a bench nearby. She wasn't just doing laundry here. She was living here. Ethan's heart sank. No child should have to live like this, hiding in a laundromat, fending for themselves. He stepped out of his car and walked up to the window. She saw him but didn't run this time. Instead, she froze, her hands gripping the fabric of a shirt tightly, her eyes wide and cautious. Ethan entered slowly, raising a hand in a gesture of peace. Gracie, he called softly, though he still wasn't sure of her name. She didn't respond, just stood there, motionless. I'm not here to hurt you, Ethan continued. I just want to help. Gracie's eyes darted toward the door, but she didn't move. Are you living here? Ethan asked gently. Where's your family? Silence. She didn't answer, just shifted uncomfortably. Ethan crouched down, trying to meet her eye level. It's okay. You don't have to be afraid. But you can't stay here. It's not safe. For a moment, it looked like Gracie was about to speak. Her lips parted, but then she quickly clamped them shut, her gaze dropping to the floor. Ethan let out a quiet sigh. He had to be careful not to push too hard, or she would bolt again. Setting, Ethan's patrol car. Ethan sat in his patrol car, watching the laundromat from a distance. His heart was heavy. Gracie's silence spoke volumes, and everything about her screamed danger. Danger she wasn't ready to talk about. But he couldn't leave it like this. Something was very wrong, and if Gracie was on her own, she was vulnerable. Vulnerable to the wrong people. Ethan leaned back in his seat, staring out at the dark streets. She didn't trust him yet. He couldn't blame her. He didn't know what had driven her to this point, but he knew one thing for sure. He was going to protect her, whether she liked it or not. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he would follow her, find out where she went after leaving the laundromat, and finally get some answers. The thoughts settled in his mind, filling him with a grim determination. He couldn't save Sarah and Jacob, but maybe, just maybe, he could save Gracie. The night air was cool, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant rain. Sheriff Ethan Waller sat in his patrol car, fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee, staring out at the empty streets of Maplewood. The town was quiet, too quiet, as always. No cars, no pedestrians, just the steady hum of streetlights and the occasional flutter of a leaf caught in the wind. The predictability of it all was both comforting and suffocating. 7 years had passed since the fire. 7 years since he lost Sarah and Jacob. The memories still clung to him like the smoky scent of the wreckage, never truly leaving him, no matter how much he tried to push them down. Ethan sighed, rubbing his hand over his tired eyes. He had taken the night shift to avoid the sunlight, to avoid people who knew him too well, who could see the cracks in his facade. The nights were better, easier. No one expected him to smile or pretend to be whole. As he turned the key in the ignition, the engine purred to life, and he began his usual route through Maplewood. Familiar streets, familiar silence. It was halfway through his shift when Ethan first saw her. The laundromat at the edge of town was the only business still open at this hour. Its fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting a dim glow onto the empty parking lot. As he drove past, something caught his eye, a small figure moving inside. A girl, no older than 10, stood by one of the machines, folding clothes with meticulous care. Her oversized hoodie hung loosely off her small frame, and her long braids fell over her shoulders as she bent over the laundry. Ethan slowed his car but didn't stop. Maybe her parents were just late. Maybe she was helping with a last-minute chore. Still, something about the way she moved, alone and quiet, stuck with him. He glanced at her one last time before continuing down the street, shaking off the unease that lingered. It wasn't his business. Not yet. Back at home, the emptiness of the house greeted him like an old friend. The walls were lined with memories he hadn't touched in years. Family photos, Jacob's drawings still taped to the fridge. The pain of their absence was constant, but he'd learned to live with it, much like the quiet grief that filled the rooms. Ethan poured himself another cup of coffee, hoping it would chase away the image of the little girl at the laundromat. It wasn't unusual for people to be there late at night. Maybe her parents had a late shift, and she was just waiting for them. It didn't explain the knot in his stomach, though. He sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window into the dark. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but there was something about her, something that reminded him of a sadness he hadn't yet faced. Over the next few nights, Ethan passed by the laundromat again. Each time, he saw the same girl, always alone, always folding clothes in the same careful manner. It became a part of his routine, just like the night shift. Every night she was there, never speaking, never meeting his gaze when he slowed the car to look inside. He couldn't help but wonder where she came from, why she was always alone. As a sheriff, he knew this wasn't normal. But as a man, he recognized something in her quiet solitude that he, too, lived with. It was unsettling, this shared loneliness between a grown man and a child. The questions kept building in his mind, no matter how much he tried to dismiss them. And with each night that passed, his concern grew, until it was something he could no longer ignore. One night, Ethan decided he'd had enough. He couldn't keep watching her from a distance, wondering if everything was fine. He had to know. He pulled his car into the parking lot, the tires crunching on the gravel. The laundromat was empty save for the girl, who was again busy folding clothes by a machine. Ethan stepped out of the car, the cool air biting at his skin, and made his way toward the door. As soon as she saw him, her eyes widened. She froze for a second, then darted toward the back of the building. Ethan quickened his pace, but by the time he stepped inside, the girl was gone. The back door to the laundromat swung softly, the bell above the door chiming in the stillness. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows on the streets as Ethan sat in his patrol car, watching the laundromat. He'd been keeping an eye on the place for days, but tonight he was determined. He had to find out where Gracie was going when she left the laundromat. Just before midnight, he saw her. She slipped out of the laundromat, her small figure illuminated by the flickering fluorescent light above the door. She carried the same duffel bag, slung over her shoulder. Ethan leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to lose her tonight. Ethan started the car, keeping a safe distance as he followed her down the street. Gracie walked quickly, her head down, as if she knew someone might be watching. The closer they got to the edge of town, the faster she moved. Suddenly, Gracie glanced over her shoulder and spotted Ethan's patrol car. Her eyes widened in fear, and without warning, she bolted. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, slamming his foot on the accelerator. He sped after her, the tires squealing as they rounded a corner. But Gracie was fast, surprisingly fast for such a small girl. She ducked down an alley, disappearing into the darkness. Ethan jumped out of his car and sprinted after her. His boots echoed against the pavement as he ran, his eyes straining to catch sight of her. She darted through a narrow gap between two buildings, and Ethan cursed under his breath as he tried to keep up. "Gracie! Stop!" he called, but she didn't slow down. Instead, she veered off the main road and into the thick brush that led to the old cemetery. The cemetery loomed ahead, its iron gates standing wide open. Ethan hesitated for a moment at the entrance, his breath coming in heavy gasps. The place was dark and overgrown, the gravestones weathered by time. He had never liked the cemetery, too many reminders of what he had lost. But this wasn't about him. This was about Gracie. Ethan stepped through the gates, scanning the rows of gravestones for any sign of her. His eyes strained against the darkness, and he called her name again. "Gracie! It's okay, you don't have to run." For a long moment, there was only silence. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. A small figure crouched behind one of the larger tombstones, trying to remain unseen. "There you are," Ethan whispered to himself, relieved that he had found her. He approached cautiously, not wanting to scare her off again. As he got closer, he saw something that made his stomach turn. A small pile of belongings, blankets, a few clothes, a faded stuffed animal, was tucked behind the tombstone. This wasn't just a hiding spot. Gracie had been living here. Ethan's heart broke as he took in the sight. No child should have to live like this, hiding in a cemetery. He crouched down a few feet away from Gracie, keeping his voice low and gentle. "Gracie," he said softly, "you don't have to be afraid. I just want to help." Gracie's eyes were wide with fear. She pressed her back against the cold stone of the tombstone, clutching her duffel bag tightly in her lap. "I'm not here to hurt you," Ethan continued, "but you can't keep running like this. It's not safe." Gracie didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes full of distrust and fear. Ethan knew he had to tread carefully. One wrong move, and she'd be gone again. "I know you're scared," Ethan said, keeping his tone soft, "but I promise you don't have to do this alone. Let me help you." For a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw a flicker of hope in Gracie's eyes. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Gracie shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. Without warning, she bolted again, disappearing into the darkness before Ethan could stop her. "Gracie, wait." Ethan called after her, but it was too late. She was gone. Ethan sat in his patrol car, staring at the darkened cemetery gates. The weight of Gracie's situation pressed heavily on his chest. She had been living there, in that cold, lonely place, hiding from something or someone. But what? He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help, and there was only one person in Maplewood who might be able to get through to Gracie, Dr. Alice Corwin, the town's child psychologist. The next morning, Ethan knocked on Alice's office door, his mind still racing with thoughts of the night before. Alice opened the door, looking mildly surprised to see him. "Sheriff Waller," she greeted, adjusting her glasses. "What brings you here?" Ethan didn't waste any time. "I need your help," he said, stepping into her office. Alice motioned for him to sit, and he quickly explained the situation. How he'd been following Gracie, how she'd been living in the cemetery, and how terrified she seemed. Alice listened carefully, her brow furrowed with concern. "That poor girl," she said quietly when Ethan had finished. "It sounds like she's been through a lot." "She has," Ethan agreed, "but I can't get through to her. Every time I try, she runs." Alice nodded thoughtfully. "She's scared, Ethan. Whatever she's been through, it's left her traumatized. If she's not talking, it's because she feels like she can't trust anyone." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So, what do I do? How do I help her?" Alice gave him a sympathetic smile. "You can't force her to open up. She'll talk when she's ready. But I can try to reach out to her, see if she'll respond to me. Sometimes kids feel more comfortable talking to someone who isn't in a position of authority." Ethan nodded. "Thanks, Alice. I'll take whatever help I can get." Later that night, Ethan sat in his kitchen, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows across the room. His thoughts were still on Gracie, how scared she had been, how she had disappeared into the night once again. There was so much he didn't know about her, but one thing was clear. She wasn't just running away for the sake of it. She was running from something, or someone. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. There was more to this story, more than he had initially realized. Gracie's fear wasn't just a child's instinct to hide. It was deeper than that, and it was tied to something in Maplewood, something dark. He thought back to the cemetery and the makeshift bed Gracie had created for herself. She hadn't chosen that place by accident. There was a reason she was hiding there, a reason she was avoiding him. Ethan's gaze drifted over to the photograph of Sarah and Jacob on the mantel. The fire that had taken them still haunted him, and now, with Gracie's appearance, those old wounds were starting to reopen. What if the two were connected? What if Gracie knew something about the past that he didn't? Ethan stood, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just going to let this go. Whatever was going on, whatever secrets Gracie was hiding, he was going to find out, and he was going to protect her, no matter what. Ethan stood outside Mayor Doyle's office, his jaw clenched. He had avoided confronting the town's most powerful figure for as long as he could, but the time had come. Gracie's fear wasn't just about being alone. It was about something deeper, something connected to the town itself. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, Mayor Doyle's voice called out, "Come in." Ethan stepped inside, and the mayor looked up from his desk, a smile plastered on his face. "Sheriff Waller, what a surprise. To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mayor, I need information. About a girl." The smile on Doyle's face faltered slightly. "A girl? Her name is Gracie. She's been living on the streets, hiding in the cemetery, and I can't find a single record of her in town. Nothing in the schools, no family connections." Mayor Doyle shifted in his seat, his expression becoming more guarded. "I'm not sure I know anything about a girl like that. Maybe she's just passing through." "She's not just passing through," Ethan snapped. "I know something is off. There's a connection here, and you know what it is." Doyle's eyes narrowed. "I don't think you understand how things work around here, Ethan. Some stones are better left unturned." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Is that a threat?" The mayor smiled again, this time colder. "Just a piece of advice. You've had your share of trouble. No need to go looking for more." Ethan leaned forward, placing his hands on the mayor's desk. "This girl is in danger, and I'm going to find out why. If you're covering for someone, you're just as guilty." Doyle's face flushed, but he didn't respond. Ethan turned and left, his heart pounding. The mayor's evasiveness confirmed what he had suspected. There was something buried in Maplewood, something worth protecting, and Gracie was caught in the middle. Later that day, Ethan made his way to Dr. Alice Corwin's office, hoping for some clarity. Alice had agreed to meet with Gracie again, to try and coax more of her story from her. When he arrived, Alice was already seated with Gracie, her soft voice filling the room as she spoke to the girl. Ethan watched from the doorway, trying not to interfere. "Gracie, I know it's hard to talk about," Alice said gently, "but whatever you're afraid of, we can help. You're safe here." Gracie looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "My mom." She disappeared. Alice glanced at Ethan, then leaned in closer to Gracie. "Can you tell me what happened?" Gracie shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know. She just went away, and I couldn't find her." Ethan's heart twisted. "Do you know why she left?" Gracie's lower lip trembled. "She told me not to trust them. She said people in the town. They weren't what they seemed." Alice's eyes met Ethan's, and in that moment, they both knew. Gracie's mother hadn't just disappeared. Something far darker had happened, and it was tied to the town's most powerful figures. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about what Gracie had said. His mind raced with possibilities, but one thing kept gnawing at him. The fire. The fire that had taken his wife and son. That night, he returned to the police station and pulled up the old files. His hands trembled as he sifted through the paperwork, looking for anything that connected the tragedy to Gracie's situation. And then he found it. Buried deep in the records was a name. Gracie's mother, listed as a witness to the fire. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. How could he have missed this? Gracie's mother had been there, and now she was gone, just like his family. His world tilted. Was the fire not an accident? Was Gracie's mother involved in something dangerous, something that had cost them both everything? Ethan closed the file, his heart pounding in his chest. His tragedy and Gracie's weren't separate, they were intertwined, and he was running out of time to find out how. Ethan returned home that night, his mind reeling. The fire had always haunted him, but now it felt like a shadow he couldn't escape. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the photo of his wife and son on the mantel. "Sarah, Jacob," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Did I miss something? Did I fail you?" He clenched his fists, the weight of his grief pressing down on him. But there was more than grief now. There was guilt and anger and a burning need for answers. He thought about Gracie, how scared she was, how she had lost her mother just like he had lost his family. And he realized that he couldn't just keep looking back. He had to move forward for her. If Gracie was protecting someone or hiding something, it was his responsibility to find out what, no matter what the cost. The next morning, Ethan returned to the cemetery. The place that had once seemed so full of death and despair now held the key to understanding everything. He walked slowly among the gravestones, his eyes scanning the area for any clue he might have missed. And then he saw it. A photograph, partially buried beneath a gravestone. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt, and his heart nearly stopped. It was a photo of Gracie's mother, standing next to Mayor Doyle. Ethan stared at the image, a cold dread filling his chest. Gracie's mother hadn't just disappeared. She had been silenced, and the mayor had been involved. This wasn't just about one girl. This was about a town-wide cover-up, a conspiracy that reached far deeper than Ethan had imagined. He pocketed the photograph and stood, his resolve hardening. He knew now what he was up against, and he knew what he had to do. The laundromat's harsh fluorescent lights flickered as Ethan sat across from Gracie. Her duffel bag was packed and sitting by her side, its weight symbolic of the burden she had carried for so long. Gracie's large, wary eyes were focused on the floor, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I'm leaving," she finally whispered, breaking the silence. "I have to." Ethan's heart sank. "Gracie, you don't have to run anymore. I'm here. We'll figure this out together." Gracie shook her head, her voice trembling. "They'll come for me. They're already watching. I can't stay. I can't let them find me." Ethan leaned forward, keeping his voice calm, though every word carried urgency. "Who's after you? Why are you so afraid?" Tears welled up in Gracie's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. "I can't. I just can't." Ethan reached out, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Gracie, I won't let them hurt you. But if you leave, you'll be out there on your own again. That's no way to live, especially when you've got people who care about you now. Let me help." Gracie glanced at the door, her instincts screaming at her to flee. But something in Ethan's eyes gave her pause. He was different. He didn't look at her like she was a burden. He wasn't trying to use her, like everyone else had. Slowly, she nodded, though her voice was still filled with doubt. "Okay, but if they come, they won't get to you," Ethan promised. "Not while I'm here." The following morning, Ethan sat at his desk in the police station, poring over files. Every new detail about Gracie's life seemed to pull him deeper into a web of corruption that stretched far beyond what he'd imagined. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Mayor Doyle. "Sheriff Waller." The mayor's voice was cold and clipped. "We need to talk. Now." Ethan's gut told him this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. "I'm a little busy, Mayor." "I suggest you make time," Doyle said, his tone a mix of warning and command. "This is important." Minutes later, Ethan found himself in the mayor's office. Doyle sat behind his desk, his expression hard as stone. He didn't waste any time. "I'm going to give you one last chance to drop this," Doyle said, his eyes narrowing. "I know you're poking around where you shouldn't be. You're digging into things that are better left buried." Ethan leaned forward, unflinching. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm giving you a warning," Doyle replied, his voice lowering. "You're playing with fire, Waller. If you keep pushing, you'll get burned. And I don't just mean you." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" Doyle's eyes locked onto his, unblinking. "That girl, Gracie, she's part of something bigger than either of us. If you keep chasing this, you'll put her in more danger than you realize. Walk away, Sheriff, before it's too late." Ethan stood, his hands clenched at his sides. "I'm not walking away. Not this time." "Then you're a fool," Doyle spat. "You can't win this." "We'll see," Ethan said, turning on his heel and storming out. Ethan drove straight to Alice Corwin's office. His encounter with Doyle had rattled him, but it had also fueled his determination. If the mayor was this desperate to shut him down, it meant he was on the right track. Alice greeted him at the door, her face grim. "I've been digging through some old town records," she said, leading him inside. "I think I've found something you need to see." Ethan followed her to her desk, where a stack of files sat waiting. Alice pulled out a document, her fingers trembling slightly. Gracie's mother, Alice began, was involved in something illegal. There are records of her working for some of the town's most prominent figures, including Doyle. But what's more disturbing is that she was silenced when she tried to expose them. Ethan's stomach twisted. Silenced how? Alice handed him a photograph, one he recognized instantly. It was the same picture he had found in the cemetery, Gracie's mother standing next to Doyle. Only this time, there was another man in the background, partially hidden in the shadows. That man, Alice pointed to him. He's linked to a series of accidents and disappearances over the years, all of them involving people who crossed Doyle and the others. Ethan's mind raced. You think they had her killed? Alice nodded solemnly. I do. And Gracie, she knows too much. That's why they're after her. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. We have to protect her, whatever it takes. Ethan and Alice gathered all the evidence they had collected and headed straight for Mayor Doyle's mansion. The sun was setting as they pulled up, the golden light casting long shadows over the grand building. This was it, the moment they had to force Doyle's hand. Ethan knocked on the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Doyle answered, his face a mask of irritation. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Doyle sneered. We have proof, Ethan said, holding up the files. Everything. Your connections to Gracie's mother, the illegal operations you've been covering up, and the people you've silenced along the way. Doyle's face twisted into a snarl. You think you can take me down with this? You're nothing, Waller. A washed-up sheriff with a dead family. You can't touch me. Ethan stepped forward, his voice low and dangerous. You're wrong. Because this time, I'm not backing down. For a moment, the air crackled with tension. Doyle's hand twitched, as if he were considering his next move. But before either of them could act, there was a loud crash from inside the house. They both turned toward the sound, and Ethan's heart stopped. Gracie! Ethan ran toward the source of the noise, bursting through the doors and into the mansion's vast hallway. Gracie's cries echoed through the halls, her voice filled with terror. Gracie! Ethan shouted, his pulse racing. He found her in a small room at the back of the house, struggling in the grip of two men. They were rough, their hands tight on her arms as they tried to drag her away. One of them pulled out a knife, holding it to her throat. Let her go, Ethan bellowed, drawing his gun. The men hesitated, glancing at each other. Gracie's eyes were wide with fear, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Do it, or I swear to God. Ethan's voice shook with fury. Doyle appeared behind him, his face pale. Stop. Let her go, he ordered, his voice trembling. You idiots. Let her go. The men reluctantly released Gracie, and she stumbled forward into Ethan's arms, sobbing. Ethan held her tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. It's okay, he whispered, his voice shaking. You're safe now. But as they stood there, with the truth of Doyle's corruption laid bare, Ethan knew this was far from over. Gracie had been saved, but the fight for justice had only just begun. Ethan sat in the quiet of his home, the soft light from the lamp casting shadows across the room. Gracie was curled up on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. She tried to stop them, Gracie whispered, her voice trembling. My mom. She knew what they were doing. The mayor, his people. She knew everything. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. What did they do, Gracie? What did they do to her? Gracie's eyes filled with tears, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. They threatened her. Said if she didn't stay quiet, they'd make her disappear. And then one night, she didn't come home. I never saw her again. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was worse than he had imagined. The corruption in the town ran deeper than he'd thought, and Gracie's mother had paid the ultimate price for knowing too much. Gracie looked up at him, her eyes pleading. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I didn't say anything, they wouldn't hurt me too. But now, I don't know. I don't know what to do. Ethan moved to sit beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. You're safe now, Gracie. I won't let them hurt you. I promise. Gracie sniffled, nodding slowly. I believe you. The next day, Ethan and Alice stood in the crowded courthouse, the tension in the room palpable. They had gathered all the evidence, photographs, documents, testimonies, and today was the day they would expose the truth. Mayor Doyle sat at the front of the room, his face pale but defiant. Ethan could see the fear behind his eyes, though Doyle tried to maintain his composure. The town's most powerful man was about to fall. The judge called the room to order, and Alice stood to present their case. Your Honor, we have evidence linking Mayor Doyle and several other prominent citizens to illegal activities spanning years. These actions have led to the disappearance and deaths of multiple individuals, including Gracie Miller's mother. The room erupted in whispers, the weight of the accusations hanging in the air. Ethan's pulse raced as the truth finally came to light. He glanced at Gracie, who sat quietly beside him, her small hands folded in her lap. She was still scared, but for the first time in a long time, there was hope in her eyes. Alice continued, laying out the evidence piece by piece. We believe that these individuals have been using their positions of power to silence those who threaten to expose them, going so far as to orchestrate accidents and disappearances. As Alice spoke, Ethan watched the mayor's expression shift from defiance to panic. Doyle knew he was cornered. There was no escaping this. When Alice finished, the judge turned to Doyle, his expression stern. Mayor Doyle, do you have anything to say in your defense? Doyle stood, his hands trembling. This is all lies. You can't prove any of it. But the evidence spoke for itself. The judge slammed his gavel down, signaling the end of the trial. Mayor Doyle, you are hereby placed under arrest. The town's leadership will be investigated thoroughly. This court is adjourned. As Doyle was led away in handcuffs, Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The truth was finally out. The town's dark secrets had been exposed, and justice was on its way. Later that evening, Ethan returned home with Gracie. The tension of the courthouse faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. For the first time in what felt like forever, Maplewood's dark cloud was starting to lift. Gracie sat at the kitchen table, her eyes following Ethan as he prepared dinner. So, what happens now? She asked quietly. Ethan turned to her, a soft smile on his face. Now, we figure out what's next for you. We get you somewhere safe, where you don't have to worry anymore. Gracie looked down at her hands, her voice small. I don't have anywhere to go. Ethan's heart clenched at her words. He walked over, crouching down so he was eye level with her. Gracie, how would you feel about staying here? With me? Gracie's eyes widened, her breath catching. You mean it? Ethan nodded, his voice filled with warmth. I mean it. I want to adopt you, if that's something you'd want. For a long moment, Gracie didn't say anything. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face, and she threw her arms around him, hugging him tightly. I'd like that, she whispered. Ethan hugged her back, his heart swelling with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt whole again. Gracie wasn't just a part of his life now. She was his family. A week later, Ethan and Gracie stood at the cemetery, a bouquet of flowers in hand. They walked slowly toward the gravestones that marked the resting place of Ethan's wife and son. Gracie stood quietly beside him as Ethan placed the flowers on the graves, his heart heavy with emotion. He had visited this place countless times over the years, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't alone. Sarah, Jacob, Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I want you to meet Gracie. She's part of our family now. Gracie stepped forward, her small hand resting on the gravestone. Hi, she said softly. I promise I'll take good care of him. Ethan smiled through his tears, placing a hand on Gracie's shoulder. Thank you, he whispered, his heart full. As they stood there together, Ethan felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. The pain of his loss would never fully go away, but with Gracie by his side, he was finally able to move forward. The following weekend, Ethan and Gracie returned to the laundromat, the place where their journey had begun. The fluorescent lights still flickered overhead, and the familiar hum of the machines filled the air. They sat together on one of the benches, watching as the washing machine spun slowly, their clothes tumbling inside. Gracie leaned against Ethan, her head resting on his shoulder. Do you remember when you first saw me here? She asked quietly. Ethan chuckled softly. How could I forget? You scared me half to death when you ran off. Gracie smiled. I was scared too, but I'm glad you didn't give up on me. I'll never give up on you, Ethan said firmly. Not ever. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past finally lifting. The laundromat had once been a place of fear and loneliness, but now it felt different, like a symbol of everything they had overcome. As the sun began to set outside, casting a warm glow through the windows, Ethan and Gracie stood and headed for the door. They had come full circle, and now they were ready to face the future together. Ethan glanced down at Gracie, his heart swelling with pride and love. "Come on, kiddo," he said, opening the door for her. "Let's go home." And for the first time in a long time, home didn't feel like an empty house filled with ghosts. It felt like a new beginning, a place where they could heal, grow, and face whatever came next, together.